thank you very much, everybody, as always, for joining our team here on Monday morning for your Monday morning COVID-19 response team roundup from Miller Johnson. This is where we try to highlight some key considerations and items for your week ahead, things that maybe should be front of mind or latest developments that may have slipped through the cracks, understandably, in the week or two before this webinar. So today we've got a pretty full agenda. We thank you for taking some time out to be with us before you get your week going. So why don't we move ahead to the next slide? We're going to have a pretty full agenda, as I said. The first couple of topics will relate to state and local funding issues under the American Rescue Plan Act, which was recently signed into law. And my colleagues Hillary Scholten and Chris Hoffmann will be doing an overview of both general funding appropriations under the ARP, or the American Rescue Plan, and then sort of within that umbrella of state and local funding, talking about one particular permitted use of funds relating to frontline worker premium pay. Then Hillary will continue on another topic, migrant housing emergency orders here in the state of Michigan, that may be relevant to some folks' businesses. I will then provide an update on the Paycheck Protection Program and a few other SBA-related small business funding developments. And lastly, Rebecca Strauss from our employment group will talk about the status of some MIOSHA COVID-19 Emergency Rule issues, extension that we're looking at, and the possibility of some federal overlay to these sorts of things. So with that all said, I neglected to introduce myself. I'm Erik Daly. I'm part of our corporate and business team here at Miller Johnson, and I'll look forward to catching up again during the small business funding portion and transitioning throughout. But for now, I'll turn it over to Hillary and Chris to talk about the state and local funding issues under the American Rescue Plan.
All right. Thank you, Erik. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Hoffmann. I'm one of the attorneys in our labor and employment section here. So our first topic here is the funding that's available for state and local governments under the American Rescue Plan Act. And I think off the top, it's important to note that we're focusing on the funding that's been allocated for states, counties, territories, and municipalities. And you should note that there's also dedicated funding for other local government purposes, such as public transit and airports and education. But here we're really just focused on the money that's been allocated to, like I said, states, counties, municipalities. So the total pot of money that we're talking about is about $350 billion. And of that amount, $220 billion have been dedicated to states, territories, and other local governments. So the of that pot of $220 billion, you have $25.5 billion that will be divided equally among the states and the District of Columbia. The rest of that money is going to be divvied up using a formula that looks at the states, the number of the state's unemployed residents over the last 3 months of 2020 compared to the unemployment rate as a whole throughout the country. So that's going to be how the rest of that money gets divided up. Can I have the next slide, please? So the other $130 billion, that's going to be allocated for metropolitan cities, non-entitlement units of local government, and counties. So of that amount, so the $130 billion, we have $65 billion that will go to counties, $45 billion that will go to metropolitan cities. So those are cities that are central cities within a metropolitan area, or any other city with 50,000 or more people that's also in a dedicated metropolitan area as defined by the Office of Management and Budget. And in Michigan, we have 34 metropolitan cities and 3 townships that qualify for that funding. After that, we have $19.5 billion that's been dedicated to non-entitlement units of local government. So these are other municipal governments that don't qualify as metropolitan cities. It includes other cities, municipalities, and townships and villages. So based on estimates that have come out of the House Oversight Committee, Michigan is expected to receive about $10.3 billion out of that total pot of $350 billion that we talked about. So of that amount, about $5.6 billion will be going to the state. Close to $2 billion will be going to counties. A little over $1.7 billion will go to those metropolitan cities. And then about $686 million will go to cities, townships, and villages. It's important to note, those are estimates that were put together by the House Oversight Committee. The Secretary of Treasury is expected to put together detailed rules on, how this money is going to be dispersed. But that's to give you an idea of potentially what Michigan and Michigan local governments are expected to receive. And you can go online. We have a link here that has will connect you to the spreadsheet from the House Oversight Committee with really detailed funding for municipalities down to the township level for Michigan. So you can go on there and see, what the House Oversight Committee has estimated that you might be receiving by clicking that link there. So when will the funds be distributed? So for the state funding, under the law, the funds are supposed to be distributed by the Treasury within 60 days of the time that the state certifies that it requires the funds and that it will use the funds only for permitted purposes. The law does give the Treasury Secretary the ability to withhold up to 50% of that amount. But that's the time frame for the state funding. For counties, metropolitan cities, and other municipalities, 50% of the funding available for those entities should be distributed within 60 days of enactment of the law. And then the law also provides that months of the enactment of the law. And then funds allocated for your non-entitlement units of local government. And again, those are the non-metropolitan cities and municipalities. Those funds are actually being sent not directly to those entities, but they're being sent to the state. And then the state has an additional 30 days before it will distribute those funds, or is required to distribute those funds to those non-metropolitan cities, municipalities, and townships. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Hillary, who will talk about the uses of this funding. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Chris. So that is a lot of money, an almost unheard of amount of money that will be flowing into the states and local units of government in bits and pieces any day now. And everyone is rightly asking, how can we use this money? How can we get a piece of this money? Well, the American Rescue Plan Act delineates 4 specified uses for the funds. The first is a direct response to the public health emergency. And that has 2 subparts. One is the health crisis, and the other is the economic fallout. So first, dealing with any health-related aspects to managing the pandemic. And then the second, economic impacts can include direct household assistance, small business support to small businesses and nonprofits, and direct aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. This next category is something new, and Miller Johnson put out a notice about this last week. It was a last-minute deal, an amendment that was added in the Senate version, and a bit of a compromise between Republicans and Democrats in Congress as to the sheer amount of money in this rescue plan. And this is premium pay for essential workers. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more on the subsequent slides when we get into key definitions. But basically, this allows for direct pay to certain eligible workers and grants to eligible employees for those who provided essential services during the pandemic. Again, I'm going to cover this more in a couple subsequent slides, and we did issue much more detailed guidance on this a few days ago, and happy to take some questions on it as well. The third permitted use is provision of government services, just covering revenue lost based on the tax base, equal to amount of the loss of revenue in the most recent full fiscal year. But note, it can't be made up. This money can't be used to make up a deficit that was the direct cause of a change in law. If the overall amount tax rate was lowered in a particular city or the state due to a change in law, the American Rescue Plan funds can't be used to offset that loss in revenue. And fourth and finally, infrastructure, water, sewer, and broadband. And I should note as well, there is a whole separate pot of money as well, similar to what Chris was talking about, how, there's money that's allocated for education and transportation. There's a whole separate pot of money also allocated for capital improvement projects. So these are the permitted uses for this large chunk of money going directly to the states and localities, and it is parallel under the state and local governments. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of these key definitions when it comes to the premium pay. So first of all, premium pay is up to $13 an hour to an eligible worker. And you see over there on the other side of the slide, we'll talk about what an eligible worker is in just a minute. There's a $25,000 per worker cap written into the bill itself. It's important to note, this is in addition to wages or remuneration that the eligible worker would otherwise receive. So, that is, if your worker is making, $15 an hour, this is in addition and on top of. It's not, for workers who are making $13 an hour. The $13 an hour is the premium pay. And it is for all workers who perform essential work during the COVID-19 public health emergency. So it's looking back at past work, it's looking at current work, and because the pandemic is still ongoing, it's looking at work going forward. Now, the definition of eligible worker, it seems official because they have included a definition in the Act. However, digging down into the weeds, you realize that really a good deal of discretion is given to the heads of government, either the governor or a mayor, a county executive, to determine who is an eligible worker. And one thing that I think is interesting about this definition is that, even though it's limited to individuals who provided essential services during the pandemic, it's not limited to those who have already been deemed an essential service. I also think it's noteworthy that this doesn't only apply to public sector employees. This money can go to private sector employees and employers if they were providing those essential services during the pandemic. Again, lots of discretion for the heads of government to designate who is an eligible worker. We are still seeing rulemaking and further interpretation on this, and the money is not available right now. You can't just apply for it. But one thing that Miller-Johnson is really trying to do is organize those who may be interested in seeing these payments come to fruition. You can imagine how much $25,000 would make, what a difference that would make in the lives of an eligible employer, how much it would mean for businesses to be able to provide that type of support to their workers who stayed on working hard during the pandemic. So, we're making the interests of those who would love to see this developed further known, having conversations with state and local leaders, and we'll be organizing a constituent meeting in the next couple weeks. So if you are at all interested in that, please reach out to me or your attorney at Miller Johnson, and we'd be happy to include you. Let's get the next slide. There are a couple other further restrictions on the use of the funds written into the Act for states, territories, and tribal governments, and local units of government as well. It cannot be used to support pension funds. You can't just make a direct payment into the pension funds. There are pretty strict reporting requirements, periodic reporting to the Secretary of the Treasury, providing a detailed accounting of the use of funds. There is a mechanism through which the Secretary, that being the Secretary of the Treasury, can recoup funds not used in accordance with the Act. And the Secretary retains the right to promulgate further rulemaking around this. And when we've been probing further on what designations the governor, the mayors might make around eligible workers for that premium pay, we've been told that the Secretary of the Treasury is working on further rulemaking around this issue. And so we don't have a timeline on it. We don't know if this is going to be just rules that are issued and then take effect immediately, or if they'll be, subject to the notice and comment restrictions, in which case it would push it further on down the line. We just don't have that information. It's all obviously very new, but we're getting as much information as we can every day. Next slide, please. Wanted to mention also transfer authority. State and local governments may transfer to a nonprofit, a tribal organization, or a public benefit corporation that's involved in the transportation of passengers or cargo, et cetera. Cities and counties may transfer to states, and sorry, that was supposed to say also tribal organizations and territories, but there's not a mechanism sort of separately for cities, for county, or excuse me, for states, reciprocity to transfer back to cities, though of course through normal mechanisms that funding may be delineated that way. So happy to take any questions on that at the end. Feel free to put it in the chat or send it separately. I know all of our contact information is in there. But let's move on to the next slide. I was also going to cover briefly some emergency orders that came out earlier this month on migrant housing. And I'm mindful of our time, so I'm going to kind of skip through these rather quickly, and again, make myself available if you do have further questions. So these came into effect, and again, as I said at the beginning of the month, they are currently in effect, though as I mentioned on a later slide, if individuals already have their license for the 2021 growing season, you have until April 1st to come into compliance with these orders. So there's some requirement of camp operators, first to develop safety protocols in the camp in compliance with OSHA guidelines that include the designation of a camp supervisor who's available to answer residents' questions on health and safety protocols. There's a pretty robust training component for all adult camp members on proper health, safety, and sanitation measures, such as wearing of PPE in and around the camp, hand washing, social distancing, etc. There's a requirement to maintain a list of all camp occupants and their emergency contacts, and then creating a designated location to post updated information about COVID-19. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there is some requirements about what you're supposed to post there. So this information has to be posted in English and in Spanish and any other language that's spoken by greater than 5% or more of the camp inhabitants. So you have to include the camp name and street address in a way that makes it easy for 911 to locate or other emergency responders to locate the camp in case of an emergency with one of the residents. Name and phone number of the current camp supervisor for individuals to easily locate. Phone number for local health department, and phone number for the Michigan COVID-19 hotline, and that's posted right there for ease of access. So next slide. Posting requirements continued, information on health and safety clinics within 10 miles of the camp, information on the location of additional sanitation and PPE supplies at the camp, and a copy of the current license issued by the department for the housing unit at the camp in particular. So that would be through MDARD. Next slide. There are additional COVID case protocols for camp operators. You have to report active COVID cases to the local health authorities, arrange for residents with suspected or confirmed cases to be seen by a qualified healthcare provider. There's no definition of what range means within the emergency order. Provide quarantine and isolation housing as necessary. So individuals who have suspected or confirmed cases of course have to either quarantine or isolate respectively. We have to provide adequate housing and space to do that. The MDARD provides additional recommendations on bed and sleeping arrangements at the camp unit, and that's available there. And then on the next slide, you'll see there's also a lot of additional resources. I'm sorry, that might be on the last slide, but the impact on licensing, as I mentioned in the beginning, if we can just go back really quickly, I think it's just one slide. Impact on licensing, yep, is that the camp must comply with the licenses issued immediately for all new licenses. So basically they're not issuing new licenses if you're not in compliance with these new emergency orders, but if you already have it, you have until April 1st, 2021 to comply. These are additional resources, pandemic, public health, emergency, those are the rules available right there. There's a COVID preparedness and response checklist, and then a preparedness and response plan FAQ laid out, really frequently asked questions. I found it to be pretty helpful. If those don't answer your questions, again, feel free to reach out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erik.
Thank you very much, Hillary. Again, this is Erik Daly. I'm a corporate and business attorney at Miller Johnson, and I've been tracking the Paycheck Protection Program and other small business funding issues, I guess, for about a year now. We're coming up, on March 27th, which will be the 1-year anniversary of the CARES Act being signed into law, and that's kind of what kicked off the whole PPP to begin with. So we're at the nearly at the 1-year mark of the PPP. It's still trucking along, and there's still appropriations available for eligible businesses. Right now, the PPP is set to expire for new applicants on March 31st. However, the House of Representatives has, apart from the American Rescue Plan, approved a 2-month extension of the application deadline. So it would take it out through the end of May, with an additional 30 days after that for the Small Business Administration to finish processing applications that are pending or that were properly submitted before the extended deadline. So as folks who have been following this know, there have been a lot of administrative delays at different points during the PPP, among other rollout turbulence. Most recently, as the program was relaunched in January due to technology upgrades and sort of a backlog of loans that were previously submitted and denied because of new information requests. It became pretty clear that they were going to need more time, especially in light of a delay in launching the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program, which we'll also talk about this morning. So the House did approve this 2-month extension, and there were only 3 votes against. I didn't bother to look to see which parties. I was kind of joking with a friend that they were probably all CPAs, because I think the CPAs are all ready for the PPP to wind down, since they seem to be in like a perpetual tax and PPP season. But but it's expected to also pass through the Senate, and the White House has voiced support for the extension as well. So I think there may be a competing, slightly different version of the extension proposed by Senator Rubio, but whether that gets taken up or if they just approve the version that the House passed, I think probably more likely that they just approve the version that the House passed. But it's not law yet, so where we are right now is still a March 31 deadline. If and when that extension actually comes into law, we'll send out a client alert, I'm sure. In other news, last week, SBA published another interim final rule, and we're well above 30 interim final rules now on the PPP. So this is the most recent one, and it implements the modifications to the PPP based on the American Rescue Plan Act. So I think in a webinar last week or the week before, I went through those modifications in some detail. Some of them were very, they were self-effectuating. They didn't really need much interpretation or implementation from SBA. There were a few others that maybe did. And so this IFR kind of addresses those that needed some implementation steps or amendments to prior guidance. The first major area that they provided some clarity in the IFR released last week was basically related to the interaction of PPP loans and shuttered venue operator grants. And as I mentioned, the shuttered venue operator grant program, although it was originally authorized in late December of 2020, has taken quite a while to kind of get ready to launch and accept applications, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the original language associated with both the PPP and the shuttered venue operator grants made it impossible to get a PPP loan after December 27th, 2020, which is when the SVOG came into law with the Economic Aid Act. However, because it has been several months now and the SVOG is still not accepting applications, the American Rescue Plan changed that approach and said, okay, you can apply for a PPP loan even if you ultimately are going to receive a shuttered venue operator grant. But if you got your loan after December 27th, 2020, any PPP funds you received after that date will reduce the amount of your SVO grant. However, if you received a PPP loan before December 27th, 2020, those PPP loans will not impact the amount of your SVO grant. So once the Economic Aid Act came into effect, if you got a PPP loan after that date, or you're planning on applying for one while you await your ability to apply for the shuttered venue operator grant, just know that that will reduce the amount of your SVO grant. And then kind of a related point is that once you're approved for an SVO grant, you can't go back to the PPP. It's a one-way street, so you can't do a U-turn after you've been approved for the SVOG or you receive the grant money and kind of go back to get a second draw PPP loan. At the end of the day, where we are right now, it shouldn't make much of a difference because your SVOG would be reduced by your PPP loan amount. So just know that as you're planning the timing of things, if, for example, you got a first draw PPP loan before your SVOG grant, you wouldn't then be able to go back to get a second draw PPP loan after using your shuttered venue operator grant funds, or at least that's how the laws currently work. And these are very flexible, as we know, over time. So who knows what will happen in the future, but that's what to plan for right now. All right. The interim final rule also implemented some other eligibility amendments for the PPP, mostly focused on not-for-profits, and then also, and I'm not going into detail on this, but online news and media outlets If you're interested in that, you can separately contact me, but it was a little too granular to justify time on the webinar for. But for non-for-profits or other 501c type entities, there is now going to be significantly potential expanded eligibility. I wasn't sure at first how much this would really impact our clients, but I think actually there may be a number of not-for-profits or 501c entities that did get a first draw loan, maybe those who didn't, but weren't eligible for a second draw loan because they had more than 300 employees. We've had a number pop up where, yeah, in fact, they have more than 300 employees, but they don't have more than 300 employees per physical location, or 500 employees per physical location, which is the test for 501c3s for a first draw loan. So if you're a not-for-profit or another 501, if you're a 501c type entity and you determine that you were previously ineligible, it's just, again, worth double checking. And for the second draw loans, you still need to have the ability to show that 25% reduction in gross receipts on a quarter-over-quarter basis in 2020 compared to 2019. But for your head count per physical location, it's worth going back to check to see if there's expanded eligibility that might benefit you. And then the other thing to be mindful of is if you're otherwise in one of these newly eligible groups of 501c entities, there are exclusions for entities that have a minimal or a sufficient amount of activity or revenue or expense tied to lobbying activities. So just be aware of that. I don't believe there's a certification on the application form that separately calls that out. So it may be something that some borrowers kind of miss in terms of determining if they're eligible or not. But there are some limits. So if you spend money on lobbying activities, or that's part of your business, or your not-for-profit activity, you'll just want to take a closer look at that. And then lastly, 501c4 entities, those remain categorically ineligible for PPP loans. But I believe all other 501c type entities have some potential way to qualify for a PPP loan at this point. And then, as I mentioned here, the IFR also notes that there need to be some updates to the PPP loan application related to these eligibility criteria, most notably the SVOG grant program certification will change a little bit along the lines I just described. And then lastly, the IFR expands some limits on kind of double dipping on, say, employee retention tax credits. So you can't claim that for a PPP expense if you get, if you claim the tax credit. That's been in effect for a while. But the new one that's implemented here, among others, is, and I wanted to call it out, if you get COBRA subsidies under the American Rescue Plan, and we've done separate webinars related to this topic, you can't get both the COBRA subsidy through the federal government and then also claim, that as an expense that's forgivable under the PPP. Okay, on the shuttered venue operator grant side, touched on a lot of this already. One thing I did want to call attention to is that late last week, the SBA did announce that it will begin accepting, or at least it plans to begin accepting, applications for these grants on April 8th, the Thursday. And in anticipation of that, SBA has launched a new SVOG portal, and you can visit that splash page for the program now. It's kind of its own website, although presently there's not a lot of new information. It really just kind of links you back and circles you back to the SBA's website, but you can see they're kind of building it out. There will be a webinar next Tuesday where SBA will go through the application process for 90 minutes. So pretty detailed webinar as far as SBA events go. That's pretty long. And the last thing I wanted to note here is that the FAQs for the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program, which are very detailed, were last updated on March 12th. And so if you're considering applying for an SVOG, it's really important to look at those frequently asked questions. Again, I was kind of joking with somebody as I was reading through them. It gets down to the level of defining what, how is a lighting rig defined for purposes of a live theater. So if you want to know how to define a lighting rig, you got to look in the FAQs if that's one of the, and it may well be one of the things that you need to provide documentation of to be eligible for one of those grants. So it's really important. There's also a preliminary application checklist and other information available, and I'd strongly recommend reading through that. And then if you're definitely planning on applying, you need to register through the federal government's grant management system ahead of time. You don't want to wait until the last minute to do that. So take a look at that portal. And then just know again that once you apply for and are approved for an SVO grant, it kind of takes PPP loans off the table for would-be borrowers. Okay, and then just a few other sort of housekeeping or good to know type of things related to SBA and small business funding. There's a new SBA administrator, Isabella Casillas Guzman, who was confirmed by the Senate last week in an 81-17 vote. So, by today's standards, that's reasonably broad support. Administrator Guzman previously served as SBA Senior Advisor and Deputy Chief of Staff in, I think, 2014 to early 2017 kind of range was most recent time at SBA. So familiarity with the administration, which is a good thing right now, given how many programs they're going to be juggling and rolling out. And then otherwise, Administrator Guzman most recently worked in a similar role for a California office of the Small Business Advocate, which is the largest state level small business specific organization in the country. And then lastly, I just wanted to note, there's no official news yet on the launch and rollout plans for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund grants, which is a $28 billion grant program similar to the SVOG that's focused on restaurants, bars, caterers, and the like. However, there was some reporting that I saw recently with some statements from at least one federal elected official indicating that they expected that program to launch within weeks rather than months, by contrast to what I described with the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant rollout. So that's where we are. We'll obviously keep people posted if and when that extension for the PPP deadline comes into effect and when we learn more about the Restaurant Revitalization Fund grant program launching. With that, I will transition it back. I'll transition it over to Rebecca Strauss, who is going to bring us home and talk about the MIOSHA emergency rule extensions and the potential for a kind of federal overlay in that area as well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. This is Rebecca Strauss from the employment section, here to talk to you about COVID workplace safety updates. Next slide, please. First, let's talk about the MIOSHA COVID-19 Emergency Rule. There was quite a bit of chit chat last week, and some of it wasn't entirely accurate. So I want to make sure you have the real deal. I heard some chit chat that went like this. The COVID-19 emergency MIOSHA rule is extended for 6 months. Ergo, office workers and those who can feasibly work from home must work from home for another 6 months. That is not true on a number of levels. So let's break that down a little bit. The current emergency rule does expire April 14th. For those of you that are not up to speed on your Administrative Procedures Act and all of its requirements, MIOSHA was allowed to issue an emergency rule for just 6 months. They did that last October. At that time, 6 months seemed like a very, very long time, didn't it? And now here we are. They're allowed to re-up the emergency order for another 6 months. And that's it, okay? Because it's an emergency order, it doesn't go through all of the normal channels for official rulemaking, and therefore there are time limits on it. Sean Egan is in charge of Michigan's COVID-19 workplace safety. He held a Q&A last week that was the source of some of this chit chat. Really what he said was not surprising at all. So let's go through exactly what the real deal is. There is a workplace safety group, work group, that is starting to meet that will recommend a phased in return to office work. Okay, the subject this last week was mostly about office work and when can office workers get back, okay? There will be some sort of extension of the emergency rule. That's true. And I don't think any of us sitting here right now expected that it would just expire April 14th with nothing to take its place, right? Because we are still in the middle of the pandemic. So there will be an extension, but it doesn't mean that the extended rule will be the exact same as the rule that exists now, okay? Just because there will continue to be MIOSHA COVID-19 rules does not mean they will be the same. The workplace safety work group is going to talk about what recommendations they're going to make, tweaks to the rule, particularly as it applies to office workers. Okay. He said that MIOSHA is not going to mandate vaccines for workers, right? So employers will not be required to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine. That was a question that came in during the Q&A. But he did say it will be an important consideration and metric for returning to offices. In other words, we may see the vaccine and what percentage of your workers have received the vaccine as a consideration when considering who can get back into the office. Okay, again, he expects that the remote work rules will be extended, but not necessarily in the exact same format they are now. There will almost certainly be a phased in approach. Okay, so this isn't going to be a light switch turning on or off. There'll be a phased in approach to return to office work. And MIOSHA will consider things like MD-HHS data. By that, I mean community spread rates, right? How much COVID-19 is in the community. Vaccination rates, again, community spread. And he mentioned the availability of childcare. Now, he didn't say whether schools were going to be open for in-person learning, but I took that from his comments. In other words, are workers going to be, is it going to be possible for individuals with school-aged children to get back into the office? So I thought that was very interesting because that didn't have to do with the safety in your workplace at all, did it? It just has to do with making sure that employees aren't fired or treated badly in any way because they have to be home for childcare purposes. So I thought that was a very interesting twist because that really isn't a MIOSHA concern, or it shouldn't be. Okay, next slide, please. What else did Sean Egan say? He actually highlighted this next point in a slide and then got several questions on it too, even though he had just highlighted it and said it. So I'm going to highlight it for you. He said numerous times, frankly, what we've been saying all along, in-person work is not strictly prohibited. It is not, even under the current rule. In-person work is not strictly prohibited if the work is not feasible to be done remotely. Okay, each employer is responsible for determining feasibility for its own employees, and it's employee by employee, or at least position by position. You must make a determination if remote work can feasibly be done remotely, particularly if you have folks in the office. You should have that determination somewhere to be able to show a MIOSHA investigator. That determination can change over time. It can include considerations such as financials and technology. And get a load of this. No business has been cited for having office workers in person. Okay, so keep that in mind. The next point, he had a question on cubicles, and this has always boggled my mind too. So this is not exactly the most pressing issue for any of you, but if you remember the shared space rules, right? One mask are required and this whole concept of shared space, how do cubicles fit into that? I will share with you what he said about that. So remember, any shared space like break rooms and hallways, masks are required. How do cubicles fit in? He said tall wall cubicles provide a physical barrier, and therefore if your folks are all sitting in tall wall cubicles, they are not in a shared space and probably no mask is required. But short wall cubicles are probably not sufficient and do count as shared spaces. Now, if you're going to ask me how tall is a tall wall and how short is a short wall, he did not mention what the exact measurements are, but we've all gotten lots of cubicle questions, so I thought I would pass on that tidbit. Next slide, please. Let's talk about this issue of the emergency rule, right? So as I mentioned, an emergency rule skips a lot of administrative process. Therefore, it can only exist for 6 months with the maximum re-up of another 6 months. But note that MIOSHA has started the formal rulemaking process for a permanent COVID-19 safety rules, okay? This indicates to me that MIOSHA believes COVID safety rules will be very important after next October, because if they re-up in April for another 6 months, that would end in October, and then there would be no MIOSHA COVID safety rules. So look forward to that. We do not know exactly what the permanent rules will look like. We hope they will be flexible, right, to change with the science, to change with CDC guidance, but we will see. My crystal ball tells me, don't hold me to this, but my crystal ball tells me that we will be seeing COVID safety rules in the workplace for a long, long time, because MIOSHA will be passing a permanent rule. Next slide, please. Let's talk about OSHA for just a second. What is OSHA? Next slide, please. And how does it fit in with MIOSHA? OSHA is a federal agency. MIOSHA is the Michigan version of that. Okay, it's literally Michigan OSHA. So MIOSHA is Michigan, OSHA is federal. And MIOSHA rule controls over OSHA guidance. In other words, if there's a conflict, you need to follow the MIOSHA rule. Okay, OSHA guidance is just that, it's just guidance. And that is all they have right now, is guidance. One of President Biden's priorities was for OSHA to issue a COVID-19 safety rule. You may have heard about that during the campaign and since, and that was a particular point of conflict with President Trump and some others, that he did not want OSHA to issue a rule. But President Biden did ask OSHA to issue a formal rule. Once OSHA issues a rule, that will control over the MIOSHA rule if OSHA is stricter. So once we have a MIOSHA rule and an OSHA rule, we look at what the strictest requirement is and we follow that one. Okay, so that could get a little bit complicated if the OSHA rule is not quite the same as the MIOSHA rules. OSHA has submitted a draft of an emergency COVID-19 safety rule to the White House. They did that on March 12th, but it's not available for public review yet. So I have not been able to see it. Once we do see it, we will, of course, let you know right away. The takeaway from my update is we will be living with COVID-19 specific safety rules in the workplace for a very long time. Okay, so this is not a temporary situation. And we should expect to see office workers getting back into the office slowly in a phase-in process, probably starting sometime in April, depending on community spread. That is what I have for you. Next slide, please. Hey, now we have all of our Miller Johnson slides, so it's time for me to say goodbye on behalf of everyone who presented today. Or maybe Erik, you want to say goodbye on behalf of everyone that presented today. But that's all for me. So have a great
No,
sunny
Rebecca, that's great. I appreciate it. And we all will say wave goodbye. Thank you. I don't see any questions pending in the Q&A area, but as always, we do want to thank people for taking this hour out of their morning, beginning of the week. I know it's a busy time and a lot of important information. So I hope that people found this useful for kind of digesting some of the key things to be thinking about this week. And stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch. We'll talk soon, and have a great day.